you done now?
Hey, this is Maya, and you're listening to The Brad Gilmore Show.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now?
Well, with the Warriors one game away from the dynasty being broken, my name is Brad Gilmore. Welcome to the Brad Gilmore Show on demand. How's everyone doing? I hope you enjoyed our episode with Tommy Avalone, where we talked to him about the Bill Murray stories, a great documentary that he has out right now. I think it's still streaming on Netflix. Also, go check out Ghost Heads, which is another great documentary that he did about Ghostbusters. Also, I Am Santa Claus with Mick Foley. For all my wrestling fans out there. Really cool guy. Really loved having him on the show, and I really loved today's episode. And guys, I think I'm going to be back early in the week. A lot of stuff going on in the wrestling world that I feel like I need to discuss, especially what just went down in Saudi Arabia at the Super Showdown between The Undertaker and Bill Goldberg. We're going to get to all that at a later date, because today on the show, I got a guy named Matt Schrader. Matt, you're going to know and love because he is the producer and creator of one of the best podcast I've listened to in at least the last year or so. It's a narrative storytelling podcast about the relationship between George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. He does it over 6 episodes. It is phenomenal. I mean, there's a score to it. There's characters, sound effects. It's a great narrative about two people who changed the entire world when it comes to the world of film, the world of entertainment. I mean, everything was changed by these two guys. The toy industry, just all entertainment in general. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have had a hand in even going to the theme parks. You know, we've had Kevin from Defunctland and Jack from Theme Park History on here. So many of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg's influences are in those theme parks. And then you want to go to even to Steven Spielberg's influence on Bob Zemeckis. Back to the Future, the podcast would have never been a thing. So these guys, I don't think it's any surprise to anyone listening to this, are so influential in our entertainment world here in America, but also the worldwide. Two awesome world builders. And today we're going to talk to Matt Schrader about his podcast, why he did it, how he created it, and we're going to talk about the relationship between Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. And I talked about him, and he is here with me from the West Coast. Matt Schrader, the host of Blockbuster, the creator of Blockbuster, which is an amazing podcast. So, Matt, first off, welcome on the show. Thanks for taking the time, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, yeah.
I'm so excited to talk to you because I went to Las Vegas maybe it was last weekend or the weekend before. I can't remember now. The days have escaped me. But I always look for something great.
As they often do.
As they often do for, yes, exactly. I was looking for, I always look for something to listen to. So normally it's an audiobook or, I'll download a couple episodes of a podcast, but I wanted something I could binge on. And I don't even remember how I found it. It was somewhere on Twitter. I saw someone say something about this Blockbuster podcast. Now, my first inclination is somebody's doing a podcast about a defunct video rental store, and I quickly realized
right.
That was not the case. It was this incredible narrative story about, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and how they became to be the masters of the cinematic universe. And so I went ahead, I downloaded all the episodes, I binged them, in my commute to the airport while I'm sitting at IAH and on the plane to Vegas. And I got to tell you, man, it was one of the most enjoyable listens to a podcast I've had in a long time. And I think a lot of times, podcasts are like this, two guys talking about a given subject. It really, for me, I haven't found a show since Serial. For those who don't remember Serial, I think it's 2015, was like the biggest show in the world. But it was a narrative about a murder mystery. I haven't found a show that gave me that same, man, I got to listen to the next episode since Serial. And Blockbuster did that. So talk to me. What was the genesis of this idea? It was such a great show. What's the genesis of the idea?
Thank you. I think we came in thinking, my background has been in journalism, but I made a documentary a couple years ago that kind of started to put me into the cinematic realm and doing some more kind of film oriented things. And really, this was a story that I came across as a journalist and said this would be a great story to have told, and that hasn't been told. This aspect has not been told before about this friendship between the two. It's the intersection of these two kind of visionary minds, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Nobody knows I mean, the insiders know, but nobody knows that they were friends and that it's them bouncing ideas off each other that starts to create, it's like this energy just starts to kind of become this huge orb that's growing and growing and growing and becomes the 1980s, becomes the 1990s. Our whole entertainment world is kind of birthed from this explosion of creativity that happens in a very short window in the 1970s. And so it was a cool story. We wanted to try to figure out a way, and when I say we, I mean myself and my film documentary team. And we thought, it's going to be difficult to shoot something like this. But the power in this story comes from the narrative aspect. So our challenge was to kind of try to invent something that hasn't been done in the podcast space before, and basically take the aspects of the true crime of the serial format for a audio presentation, and merge that with the kind of all of the creative elements of a film production, and essentially create our whole model from the start, which was, let's make a movie for your ears, and something where you can feel like you're inside of that story and witnessing things happen through the eyes of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who at the time are unproven, creative, wannabe directors. And that was kind of the inspiration for this. We thought it'd be a really cool thing to kind of get into their headspace.
And you really hit the nail on the head with the show. I think even with the first episode, and I'm not going to go into specific spoilers, because I don't really, even though this story is out there, I want people listening to this to experience it for the first time. But even the way that the show starts off, because explain to me this, there was a little contingent, about five or six directors, a little congregation, if you will. These were the guys who they'd get together, they'd critique each other's projects and all that stuff. Talk to the people about who these directors were, because I think they may have heard of them before. Yes, they've definitely heard of them. So it was a group that has come to be referred to now as the movie brats, and it was Francis Ford Coppola, who, of course, Apocalypse Now, The Godfather, so many other great films. He was kind of the first of this group to break out into his own, now he's a serious director, and he had this kind of spirit, this, in the 1970s, it was, hey, let's think about film a different way, and let's tell different types of stories and whatever. And he started a production company. He brought in George Lucas once he graduated from college, once George Lucas did. And then this team of kind of these creative people, the New York guys, Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, they kind of join in this group, and Steven Spielberg is the youngest of them. And so there's this new kind of creative spirit that's happening in Hollywood and in entertainment, but they all of the group pretty much wants to make kind of serious films. And your kind of average person, I think, can see something. There's a difference between kind of the serious film thing and the blockbuster approach. We don't think of maybe the Avengers as a super serious, but it's fun, it's huge, it's grand, but it's a different kind of a thing. And at the time, that thing didn't exist yet. That kind of big escapism blockbuster model it had to be invented. And the two people of this group that shared that vision were Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. And that's why they connected so early on.
And do you think it's because a lot of the times, I think as we get older, the reason why, I don't want to say less creative, it's not the right way to frame it, but when you get older, you understand more how things work, right? You say, well, this is the logical approach of doing things. But do you think that the innocence of being a child and having that imagination, is that what separated George and Steven from the rest of the group, saying like, well, why can't we do it this way?
To some extent, yeah. Yeah, and I think there was a lot of things that I came across in research and kind of putting this all together. Of course, Steven Spielberg is the youngest of this group. He also seems to have the most kind of passion for going out and trying to figure out cool visual ways to tell stories. And then George is kind of this abstract thinker. What if we do things a little differently? The whole project we do a little bit differently. And people think of him as kind of this borderline crazy guy that has good ideas, but he's going to have to rein those in if he's ever going to be successful. And I think part of it was their naivety. They were in their late 20s. They still hadn't hit it big. They were kind of still just struggling to do something creative that would make a name for themselves. And that was the thing that I think propelled them forward, just the kind of ambition of that. And of course, the interesting thing in the story we tell in Blockbuster is everything then falls apart. Steven gets Jaws. It's a disaster. He's never going to get hired again. George does Star Wars. The studio is talking about replacing him as a director. Things are falling apart. This is a stupid sci-fi movie, and it's the same kind of storyline here where nobody believes in them, but they are each other's kind of support system through this period. And the only person that really believes in George through this whole process is Steven Spielberg saying, listen, buddy, like this thing can make a lot of money. Don't give up on this thing. This is going to work, this Star Wars thing. And of course he was right.
Well, yeah, he hit the nail on the head there. But before we get into their successes, and I want to get, your ideas on a couple of their films and kind of where you think that they sit in the pantheon of American cinema. But let's start though with putting this show together. So you do the research. We know what we have to do, right? We know that we want to tell this story of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, their friendship, and then almost kind of end it. Was that actually the original idea for the ending? Like, let's end it after they both have, kind of made it in a sense?
The ending changed a little bit through the process. We were trying to kind of figure out where, we really, I guess I have to take a step back in kind of creating the story arcs for each character. And there's really three story arcs. There's Steven, there's George, and there's their composer, John Williams, who kind of comes in and saves Jaws, and Steven has been very open about that. He saved it. If not for the music, there's no shark in the movie pretty much. And everyone thought it looked stupid and laughed at it in all their test screenings. But the music totally changes that, and all of a sudden it's this hit. And then of course, John Williams' impact on the Star Wars music is just, there's a lot of things that fell into place on Star Wars, but the music is among the most recognized and famous, and ultimately ends up making a name for John Williams in a way that no composer or musician in Hollywood ever really had. And so there's these three kind of storylines, and we wanted to be able to have a full kind of arc for each character and do it journalistically, so that we weren't doing anything that stretched, what was actually true. But we set out with George and Steven. They're very ambitious. They're very naive. They go through just a mess of a production, and everyone loses faith in them. And they kind of, the story resolves as they're laying the seeds for what will become the 1980s and the great Indiana Jones films, which they of course work together on. It's the first projects that they directly work together on, and they're huge hits. But it's kind of about them discovering, just as artists, discovering what their calling really is. And it's that kind of that ambition, that passion, that desire to push things forward, to do things a little bit differently, to be creative, even if they think, it's opening weekend for Star Wars and this thing's going to be a disaster and all the critics are going to hate me and it's going to be tough to ever get another job. But maybe there's something creative we can do next year.
Right. Yeah, and Star Wars only had a limited release at that. The studio was not very confident in the film. They said, well, maybe we can build some buzz this
32
way.
theaters.
Wow, can you
think
imagine?
About that, 32, it's crazy. That's, there's more cities right now just around Los Angeles that can show something than that. And 32 theaters is what they opened in.
And it really is so incredible to think about that. 32 theaters, when I think the last Avengers movie, Endgame, I think it opened in 4,400 theaters. So just to put it into kind of some kind of perspective, Star Wars is this movie that was a cult phenomenon, but started off with really destined to fail in a lot of ways.
Yes, and there's a whole struggle behind that. The studio thought that this whole thing was going to be a dud, of course, but they are trying to negotiate with theaters to try to salvage this horrible Star Wars project, that no one wants. And all the theaters are saying, listen, we don't really want to show that. Like, we're more interested in other stuff that you have coming on later in the summer. So I think we'll pass on Star Wars. And Fox is desperate because they've just blown a ton of money on this project and they might not get it back. And the studio, this is at a time when studios are starting to fold up and go bankrupt and be, resold, and they become a part of some other studio. The 1970s were not a great time for the studios, but of course the Blockbuster era changed that.
Absolutely. And let's talk about John Williams for a minute, because I've always been fascinated by this man, because and you could go up to somebody who's not a film fan, or even a casual fan at that. Maybe they've seen all these movies once, maybe twice, right? You could go up to him and say, hey, hum the theme to Indiana Jones or to Superman or to Harry Potter or to Home Alone even. And all these themes come from the same exact guy. And I don't know how can somebody be so musically a genius for cinema, but why do you think that John Williams was able to capture the essence of these blockbusters better than anybody else? I mean, so much so that Steven Spielberg goes back to him every time. So much so that he still, John Williams still scores every Star Wars film that comes out, or at least the majority of them in the Skywalker saga. Why was he able to capture that better than anyone? I know there was a fascination with the King Kong score, which, if you want to speak on that a little bit, that was kind of like the meter stick, the measuring stick. If you will.
I think it comes from a long tradition, but it was one of those things. It's, we always hear those kind of stories from thousands of years ago about some invention. Back in the day, people thousands of years ago had some early version of a spark plug, and then that technology was forgotten and it kind of had to be reinvented for a new purpose. And then it kind of starts to become something that or worked into cars and, whatever. It's that kind of a thing. But I think that also happens with creative things. And I think we see that happen a little bit in the last century or century and a half of film, because you have this kind of this big European orchestral tradition, the kind of the Mozart and Beethoven thing that starts to come over to the United States and join the film industry, which is the only place there's a lot of jobs for orchestra people. And so film starts to take on this kind of this unique thing that we now associate with film, but it all kind of disappears in the mid-century. You have like the James Bond, you think of the James Bond theme, that's like a jazz theme. There's not an orchestra there. And so a lot of those kind of things start to disappear, and you have Easy Rider, and that's using a lot of popular music and rock music. And then there's kind of this rediscovery of this, and I think that comes from John Williams. And Steven's ability to put a large part of his film into the hands of a musician, to allow for musical storytelling. And I think maybe the best example of what that can do is if you watch the end of E.T., it's this extremely powerful kind of concert ending, but it plays with the big grand finale of the film, and it gives you goosebumps when you're watching this. And I think that's the kind of amazing marriage between music and picture that can happen if you have two creative people that are on the same page. And really that's where I think Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and John Williams all kind of started to change the style of entertainment, because everything starts to imitate that and see, wow, this music is playing a big part in this, and let's bring this back in, and kind of the old outdated orchestral stuff. Maybe it's not that old and outdated after all. Maybe we can do new things with it. And again, now we think of that as it's a staple of going to the cinema.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people. I mean, I guess you even go back to the soundtrack. I mean, a lot of people love listening to the cinematic scores of these films in leisure, and I think that's in large part to John Williams. And I think obviously he's at the top, but almost every theme, it's just, if you go through his filmography of films that he has scored, it's almost every single recognizable film theme came from this man's mind, with the exception of the Bond theme and then maybe like Back to the Future by Alan Silvestri. Every other like blockbuster theme that you can think of has come from John Williams. And I've always heard that Star Wars was saved by the editing and by the music. Without those, without George Lucas's wife and John Williams, there probably wouldn't be a galaxy far, far away today. Which leads me to this. A lot of times, like you said, blockbusters like Avengers or what have you may not be looked at as the most serious of film. But they capture a large audience. There are highly skilled actors, directors, and visual effects people who are working on these films, yet they're often looked over at the show of shows for the film universe, the Academy Awards. And I know the Oscars played around with this notion of a best popular movie last year. But why do you think that movies, like the superhero films of this decade and in prior films of the blockbuster genre, don't really get a lot of love outside of the visual effects categories?
It's a great question, and one I may not be qualified to fully answer, but I will say I think that generally when it comes to a lot of the award shows, they are and kind of those audiences, they're looking for a very kind of traditional style that's married with themes that are important. And so you see a lot of things that, a lot of films that have social commentary in them and that have kind of these ideas. They're not really ones, these films that are about the big breakthroughs in special effects or in, the way that something looks, some breakthroughs in cinematography even. I mean, that's celebrated as its own thing, but it doesn't really earn the film that much. And so I think that's one of the weird kind of splits that we've seen, where a lot of the kind of Academy Award type of audience is reacting really strongly to almost the kind of films that Brian De Palma and Martin Scorsese were talking about in the 1970s, these things that have this kind of social importance to them. And not as much to the aspect of let's create a world that people can go live in and they can go imagine themselves being a part of. And this crazy idea of, different galaxies and planets and worlds and all these spaceships that are, dusty and dirty, and they've clearly been used for centuries. And it's a really interesting, it's almost like a great novelist. It's the difference between, in many ways, a great novelist who's creating a story out of nothing and someone that's using kind of the existing parameters of our own reality to say something interesting. And I think the world building side of what George Lucas and Steven Spielberg both did, they draw you into this film where the rest of society isn't really the point. The point of this is it's about this story. It's about the characters that are in this. It's about what happens to them, and we relate to them. And it's a different kind of experience than something walking out and saying, wow, I'm really inspired to go create change. It's not that. Instead, it's something that says, wow, that was an amazing experience. And it's almost hard to put into words exactly what it was about that. But I felt like I was there and experiencing this firsthand.
I think that is a good characterization of the differences, and it's always been one of those things that just is like, well, I just saw this movie, it was so great, why isn't it getting more recognition other than box office receipts? But it's all in the eye of the beholder. But to go back and spend some time on the music side, the score of not these big films, but the score of your podcast was so impressive. The music that went into it, recreating the scenes, especially going back to the John Williams, when George Lucas is hearing, I think they were in London, hearing the music for Star Wars mashed up to the film for the first time, and he calls Steven Spielberg, the recreations of that. Talk to me about the use of music in your own podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we came in here and the documentary that I did a couple years ago was about film music. It's called Score, a Film Music Documentary, and we interviewed, it was very kind of traditional interviews, and we were putting it together with all these great examples and showing a little behind the scenes of what a film composer does on a modern film. And I met a composer while we were working on that film and kind of finishing that up, and said, hey, I need you to write some music in between the John Williams section and the Hans Zimmer section, please. And he said, "Are you kidding me? What? You would need me to live up to those expectations?" And I said, "Yeah, you can do that, right?" And he worked he totally just killed it in what he actually put together. But I came back to him because he had knocked it out of the park on that film and said, "Hey, now we have this thing that's about, basically the rise of John Williams, and we want to be able to lend some kind of John Williams sound to that." And it was the same reaction where he was like, great. So now I have to go try to emulate the greatest, the most memorable things of John Williams ever. And I said, no, like, let's take a step back and let's approach this as an original score. We don't want it to sound like it's a knockoff of John Williams and just change a couple notes here and there, and otherwise it's the Jurassic Park theme. Like, I've heard that before. Doesn't sound good. Let's go back. Let's try to actually create original themes for each character. So in our storytelling, we have a George Lucas theme, we have a Steven Spielberg theme, we have a John Williams theme, and much the way John Williams actually uses those different themes in Star Wars, the Luke theme and the Leia theme, the Force. There's all these different things that all kind of interact and they cross over with each other and they blend together. And you might have a scene of, someone on screen and then just hear, the Imperial March or the Darth Vader theme somewhere. And you just know that even though he's not on screen, he's there hovering somewhere. And it's a cool way of adding to the storytelling. And in this case, we could do that with ideas. And when George would think up something that was, some idea, or remember something Steven said, or talk to John about something, there was a little kind of, flavor of another character's theme that we could weave in, so that the whole series was tied together musically too. And a lot of work went into that. We ended up working with Ryan Taubert, Benjamin Botkin are their names, the two composers who worked on it. And we started with the themes and built those right up to the whole kind of orchestral approach. And did it very much in the spirit of John Williams. So it's not something that sounds like it's a knockoff, but it's something that treats the orchestra the same way. Everyone in the orchestra kind of has their part, has their way that the music interacts with things. And that's very much a John Williams thing.
Yeah, and for people, when y'all listen to this podcast, if you haven't already, the music, once again, like John Williams, plays such a big part, especially in those recreations of John Williams playing the Jaws theme for Steven Spielberg for the first time, or any of those things. Right. Those are the scenes that stuck out to me the most. And those and the interactions between George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. I mean, obviously that was the goal of the podcast, was to really focus on their relationship. But I even love the small things like, hey, I'll give you 4% of Star Wars if you give me 4% of Close Encounters, or whatever the deal was. And it ended up being like a $40 million deal for Steven Spielberg. That's right. Not a bad handshake agreement where I come from. And then culminating in this trip to Hawaii. What did you find out? Because I've heard about this legendary trip to Hawaii that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas took. I heard about that before I listened to the podcast. And then when I what was cool, I didn't know that it occurred the day that Star Wars was coming out in 1977. And, George is sitting at the Chinese theater seeing this line, but it's like, I just want to get away. What did you find out? How did you find out all these details about that infamous or that famous Hawaii trip?
There's a lot of research that we did that was original here, and digging into not only kind of the secondary resources, so newspapers and lots of clips and other books that have been written, but also the original sources for things and original interviews that they gave back in the day, that George Lucas gave, that Steven Spielberg gave around this time. And part of what we constructed in Blockbuster was we wanted to actually try to use their words and descriptions and get as close to what actually happened at the time, before it was kind of clouded by the mystique, the myth of what they would accomplish for the next couple decades. But just in that moment when they're still kind of just another director, just another filmmaker, that's the era that we wanted to kind of tap into, so that it was authentic and it was true to life. And that's where a lot of the interaction and the scenes that we were able to reconstruct came from. It was bits and pieces of different things that we can then take, this piece fits here, this piece fits here. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. And eventually we had, 499 out of 500 pieces, and we could say, okay, this last piece must look like this. We can reconstruct that, and that's largely our approach here. We wanted it to be journalistic, but we also needed it to be authentic and to feel real, and I think that was the goal of this. And it is amazing to me that and this was one of those scenes at the end of the series where Stephen and George are sitting on a beach in Hawaii, as you alluded to, and they are both kind of depressed about their careers. Even Stephen, after doing Jaws, because he's never going to do any better than Jaws, and they're sitting in the sand and they're building a sandcastle. And I just thought, is that not the perfect metaphor for what these guys do? They want to build worlds, and they want to. It's the creative part of this that's fulfilling. The success comes after, but really their passion is in creating something, and something that's really immersive, and something that's really incredible and amazing. And that's actually the exact scene where they dream up what will become Indiana Jones, or as they call it in the moment, Indiana Smith.
Indiana Smith. It's so funny. It's sometimes a criticism of George Lucas, as great as he is. They always say, well, he just needs to be, it's always one thing that's just a little off that we got to focus him in on. And Indiana Smith just doesn't have the same ring to it. But what's crazy too, though, is the podcast series stops essentially after they've gained pretty big notoriety, especially Steven Spielberg, more than George Lucas at the time. Star Wars, of course, would go on to make him a household name, but really their reign of dominance was in the 1980s. When you have the subsequent Star Wars sequels, the Indiana Jones franchise, and then even expanding on to, the early 1990s with Jurassic Park. That's when, really the 80s, though, for my opinion, solidified these two guys as the top of the food chain in Hollywood. So I'm saying that to say it seems like you may have left a little meat on the bone if you want to continue this series in the future.
There's a lot of meat.
So is that something that y'all want to do?
We may be doing that. We may be doing that. Yeah, there's a lot in the 1980s. It's like a lot of, it could very easily be a multi-part season, and we're throwing around a few things that are interesting that are happening at the same place. Famously, James Cameron was a truck driver when Star Wars came out, and he said, oh, geez, I got to get my life together. If I ever want to make a movie, I'm never going to do it as well as Star Wars just did. So I better go do something. And he went and he became a production assistant on some random crappy film. and he got a job doing that and worked his way up through some special effects stuff. And of course becomes the James Cameron that we know. But that comes from this initial kind of inspiration of what all happened in the 1970s, and I think there's a lot left to tell, but it's that initial kind of curiosity and the rise of these people that I think inspired so much of the modern entertainment world, and it's everywhere in the zeitgeist. Stranger Things, that is Spielberg, that is all callbacks to the kind of 1980s Spielberg thing. That started in the 1970s. Even you can look at Close Encounters, and it's very, very similar. Parts of Jaws, the scariness of certain things. It all calls back to certain kind of seeds that they've planted that have now become so ingrained in the culture. And of course, the Avengers. There wouldn't be an Avengers, this massive, incredible Avengers, 22 film series, had Star Wars not been able to do that first.
Really is. There's just so much there. And what another thing that's great about the podcast series are these little peripheral characters that'll come in and out, maybe make just a little cameo. I think toward the end of the podcast series, there's a brief mention and dialogue from Robert Zemeckis, who of course would go on to direct Back to the Future, which is my favorite film series of all time. And, he was just an assistant at the time to Steven Spielberg. And really, if you look at Robert Zemeckis' career, he kind of had a similar start to Steven Spielberg. Is I made this movie, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then use cars, and nothing's really working. I need something to really pop, and it was Romancing the Stone was his first huge blockbuster, if you want to call it that, movie. And then he went on to do Back to the Future and Forrest Gump and all those films after that. So there's so many things that have spawned off of Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. This one friendship kind of created this whole cinematic world of not just their own, but of so many others like the Jim Camerons and the Bob Zemeckis of the world. Just incredible stuff.
Yep.
And what's been, though, the feedback that you've gotten from listeners or anybody? Maybe have you heard from anybody involved, in the Spielberg camp or the Lucas camp, anything like that?
A few, not the main characters.
Right.
Although we've heard that it's come across their desk. They're obviously very busy. But we approach this whole thing in a journalistic manner. And the last thing that again, this is maybe in the weeds, but coming from a journalism background, the last thing that you want to do if you're piecing together something accurately is go to those kind of main people that are characters in something. And instead, we really sought out the words of those people from 40 years ago, to try to make sure that it was authentic to all of that research back in the day, instead of maybe inviting a criticism from viewers or from listeners that this is PR for someone's, production company or whatever it may be. So, and I think fortunately we were able to put together a clear enough picture of everything that the feedback has been great. And, I would encourage your listeners, if they have any interest in this, give it a listen. It's all free. It's ad free. It's kind of a new business model for this. If you like it, you can throw us a few bones at our website, getblockbuster.com. But the most important thing is to just give us a rating, give us a review, totally free, and won't cost you anything except for a few seconds. And I think we're doing pretty well. We're at a 4.8 out of 5, so people seem to be liking it.
Hey, well, if you that's like a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes if you put the film out, so that's doing pretty good.
Yeah,
that's doing pretty good. Well, Matt Schrader, the podcast is called Blockbuster. Go get it right now in your favorite podcast app. Highly recommended from me. You'll probably binge the entire season in the first day, and then you'll be blowing up Matt on Twitter saying, "Please come out with season 2. We need more. We need more of Blockbuster immediately." And hey, maybe we'll see it. But let people know where, aside from the podcast, where they can find you and follow you.
Yeah, the podcast is on Twitter. It's at Blockbuster Pod. We're on all other platforms too. I think just Blockbuster Pod. And my handle on Twitter is Matt Schrader, MattSchrader. People always forget the C, but that's me.
Well, that is the world builder in podcast form, Matt Schrader, the creator of Blockbuster. Go check out this show. You really need to. Matt, thanks again, man.